Hey guys, welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And if your question doesn't get answered in this video, just go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to write any new questions that you have. Also, please like all the questions that you want answered because I generally answer them in order of how many likes they have. Although I think I'm going to start moving just a little bit more in the direction of answering the questions that I think are useful or interesting. But I will definitely answer all of the most highest voted ones. Just when I get down to the bottom of the ones that only have like 3 or 4 likes, I might just start picking the ones that I like the best. And also, as you can tell, the video quality today isn't as good as it has been on the last few main channel videos that I've put up. And that's because although I am using my new camera today, I'm using a capture card, which basically means that I'm not writing directly to an SD card inside of the camera. Instead, I have the camera hooked up to my computer and I'm basically recording as if my camera was a webcam. And either due to the speed of my computer or due to the capture card that I got, which is basically the thing that allows you to use a good camera as a webcam, I haven't been able to get as good quality. And so I'm going to keep playing with it and hopefully get it better in the future. But just the thing is, if I'm recording with my camera with no capture card, then I can only record in 20-minute chunks. And for a video like this, which is probably going to be over an hour long, that would be really annoying to have to do. And so that's why today I'm filming it on the capture card, so I can just film it in one go and not have to worry about, continually stopping it. So yeah, sorry if the resolution doesn't look that great today. Hopefully it would still look better than if I was using my actual webcam, which is like $50. But in the preview, it looks decent. So yeah, hopefully it's not too bad. But anyway, if it turns out that it is like really, really bad looking, then I'll continue to play with it and hopefully I'll be able to get it better in the future. Okay, so let's get started. So Link asks, can you talk a little bit about how exactly one do active immersion when you're not mining cards? So exactly how does one do active immersion when you're not mining cards? If you're watching a video, do you just look up words that call your attention, read their definition, and then forget about it and move on? Should you perhaps spend more time thinking about the word and trying to nail it into your head, thinking of connections with other words, thinking of little mnemonics, or something similar? What if you did all your immersion not looking up words at all? How would that compare? So off the bat, I want to recommend you to check out the new MIA Japanese Quick Start Guide that I have written, because that answers a lot of probably questions that you're going to have. I have the first section of the Quick Start Guide is on immersion, and it goes into a lot of the nitty gritty details of exactly what you're doing. But to talk about it a little bit here, so basically, the way that you approach immersion shouldn't be that different whether you're mining cards or not mining cards. Because the way that I recommend going about it is basically you're just actively immersing. And if a word calls your attention, either because if you don't know the meaning of or the fact that you don't know the meaning of that word is inhibiting you from understanding a plot point, or just because the word looks familiar and you're just curious about what it means, you should look that up if you can, right? Like, for example, if you're just listening while you're cooking, then, well, I guess that wouldn't be active immersion, so it's not relevant. But if it's active immersion, then if you're using subtitles, it's going to be easy to look something up because you can copy and paste it. If you're just watching something raw with no subtitles, then you're going to have to hear the word clearly enough for you to guess how it's spelled and then look it up that way. And so if you're in a situation where you think you might be able to successfully look it up, either because you're using subtitles or because you heard it clearly, then just go ahead and look it up and see if you can find it. Now, if you find it and it kind of clicks, then you can just go back to your immersion. There's nothing you have to do, because basically, if a word was really primed for you to learn, then reading the definition should pretty much be enough to get the effect that you want. Because ideally, after you read the definition, you're going to understand more of what was just happening in that scene in your immersion, right? So let's say there's like two people in a grocery store, right? And they're talking about, like, do you want to get like apples or X? And you don't know what X means, and you look it up and then you see that it means bananas, and then it's going to make sense, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. They were talking about, do they want to buy apples or bananas, right? And so in that sense, then the fact that you just understood more of an actual scene that you were watching due to you learning the meaning of a word, that is going to have an effect on your brain and your memory. And even if you don't just, perfectly remember the word from that point onward, you might forget it a few times in the future. You're never going to fully forget it, right? The next time you come across that word, it might feel even more familiar. You might feel like, oh man, I feel like I looked this word up before, but I can't remember what it means. Then you'll look it up again, and then you'll go, oh yeah, I remember, this is banana, because of that, just like in that one scene where they were deciding if they wanted to buy a banana. And so maybe it will take you a few times of looking up the same word before it fully, makes stays put in your memory without you forgetting it. But that's just how the process works, right? And so that very first time that you looked it up, that was the beginning of the process of you fully learning that word. And so you don't have to do anything, right? You don't have to try to think deeply about it or try to make a mnemonic or anything like that, because, in my opinion, mnemonics aren't very useful when we're talking about learning words, because in order to use a mnemonic, you have to recall the mnemonic. Right? And so you don't want to be seeing a word and then being like, oh, I have a mnemonic for this word. Let me recall the mnemonic. Okay, I recalled the mnemonic. Now I know the word, right? That's not really, it's kind of just roundabout and not very useful in the context of language learning. Mnemonics can be good in other areas of life when you're trying to memorize. And it has, with things like kanji, then mnemonics can be useful for learning the kanji. But in general, you just want to be making direct connections between words and what they mean in your head. And as long as you're actually immersing regularly, this should not be hard to do. And so, yeah, basically, you just read the definition, and then, in a way, you can let yourself forget it. If you have a feeling of oh man, the second I read the definition, I'm just going to forget it. That's totally fine. It might feel that way, but really, you're never going to go back to the state of never having known what that word meant, right? Because just like I said a second ago, you can forget it temporarily, but it's going to be easier for you to remember it the next time, a little bit. And so, that's just part of the process. Forgetting, learning and then forgetting it's not a bad thing. It's not a failure. It is just part of the learning process. And so, yeah. And then as to, in regards to trying to make connections between that word and other words, again, this isn't something you have to do intentionally. This is something that's just going to happen naturally. That's just the nature of the brain, right? If you look up a word and then you see that this word uses the same kanji as another word that you're going to naturally notice that. Or if you notice that the reading is the same, then you're going to naturally notice that. The brain will do the pattern recognition for you. The brain, your brain, whatever. And so you don't have to go out of your way to try to make that happen. And also, if you try to go out of your way to make that happen, then you're going to be, it's going to be very exhausting and you're going to wear yourself out. And so, yeah, I would say basically when you're immersing, when you're looking up a word, just look it up. And if you find it, great. Just go back to your immersion. Don't worry about trying to remember it. And if you can't find it, that's whatever. And so then as to how often should you be looking things up, I also cover this in the guide. But basically, you don't want to be on either extreme. Well, actually, basically the deal is the only real extreme that you don't want to go to is the extreme of looking too many things up. Because if you try to look too many things up, like you're looking, you're pausing to look something up every few seconds, then that is going to that's going to make it even more difficult to remember what words mean, because you're just going to be constantly resetting your short-term memory when you're just okay, this means that, this means that, this means that. That's going to make it a lot difficult for memories to stick in your brain. And also it's just going to be extremely exhausting and not fun, right? If you're constantly interrupting the flow of your immersion, then it's not going to really feel like you're watching a TV show anymore or watching a movie. It's just going to feel like you're just sitting and looking things up in the dictionary. And that is not a very productive activity. And so you want to make sure that you limit how often you look things up. And I have a video called How Often Should You Look Things Up? But basically, maybe once every few minutes would be a good time span to try to look something up. And then as to the other extreme, if you're feeling tired because you're exhausted and it's the end of the day or whatever, it's okay to not look anything up. You can just kind of sit back and relax and enjoy your immersion if you're really just not feeling like looking anything up, or you're just, your energy level isn't very high at the moment. Because really what you want to be fueling this process is curiosity and the joy of learning, basically. And so if you force yourself to look things up when you don't feel like it, just because you have some sort of obligation, like, oh, I need to learn as quickly as possible, then you're going to make an association of looking things up and those negative emotions of oh, I have to do homework. This is like a homework assignment. I need to get a good grade on it, right? And that's not the association you want. You want it to just feel like, oh, I'm just curious what this word means. let me look it up out of just curiosity. Oh, wow, that's what it means. That's cool. I feel like I just learned something. And then there's joy from that, right? You want it to be fueled by positive emotions. And so in order to make that happen, it's really crucial that when you're feeling like unmotivated or whatever, you can just sit back and relax and enjoy your immersion. And if you do that, probably over time, you will start to build some curiosity. Once a really juicy word comes by, when you're just like, I feel like I see this word every single day. What does it mean? You will get curious, because eventually words will start popping out at you and they'll be shoved in your face. And so that's the right time to look it up. And so basically that's all you do, right? Like, that's active immersion. Is in the beginning, you're really just trying to understand messages and pick out words, right? You don't really have to worry about the particularities of the grammar or pitch, accent, or intonation or pronunciation or really anything like that. Really just focus on trying to understand. And the first step of understanding is picking out words, right? And so really you're just trying to pick out words and try to piece together as much of what's going on as you can. And a component of that is looking up words. And now also, I think I mentioned that there shouldn't necessarily be a strict distinction between when you're mining and when you're not mining sentences. And that's basically just because, you're looking up words when they pop out at you. And when you come across a really good one target sentence, by the way, if you haven't read the guide, so we're changing the terminology from I+1 to one target, because I+1 originally comes from Stephen Krashen, and the way that he used the word I+1 is different than the way that we're talking about I+1 when we're talking about mining sentences, right? And so I have more information on the Quick Start Guide if you want to learn more about that. But basically, instead of calling it a I+1 sentence, we're just calling it a one target sentence, because that's way more straightforward, right? It means there's a sentence where there's either one target word or one grammar structure, or one target word, one target grammar structure, and then you know the rest of the sentence already. And then once you look up, or once you infer the meaning of the target word or grammar structure, then you can understand the meaning of the sentence as a whole. So it's a one target sentence. A zero target sentence would be a sentence that you already understand fully, and a multi-target sentence would be a sentence that has multiple unknown components of it. And when you write one target sentence, we're just writing it like one, like the number one, and then T, so that it's like easy to write out. But so basically when you find a really juicy one target sentence, you can copy that down into like a text file or something like that. And then I recommend having a separate period of time where you're actually making cards. So basically when you're immersing, you're looking up juicy words, you're also collecting sentences, but you're not really making the sentences into cards yet. You're just copying them into a text file or taking pictures of them or whatever. And then later you have card making time where you're going to go and can, take your list of sentences that you've gathered and then make those into cards. Now, if you're taking a kind of different approach to sentence mining where you're using subs to SRS and Morphman and things like that, then this might not really apply to you. But if you're taking an actual mining approach where you're manually mining the sentences from your immersion, this is what I would recommend doing. And so when you take this approach, then there's not a strict distinction between mining and not mining, because whenever you're immersing, that's an opportunity to find a good one target sentence. And you should always be looking things up unless you're, tired and you're just in kind of chillax mode and you're waiting for your curiosity to build back up, And now the last part of your question, what if all you did was immersion and you didn't look words up at all? Well, I think you'd still learn words just through context, and you'd still pick a lot of things up, but I think the process would be slower. You'd just progress slower, because when you look things up, you're making mental dictionary entries, and over time you're also remembering what words mean, which increases the comprehensibility of your immersion, and so it basically just expedites the whole process. And so I think that you could definitely still learn if you didn't look anything up, but you'd just be learning more slowly than you would if you were looking things up. So, yeah. So next question. Let me take a sip of coffee. Michael Huang asks, Hi Matt, besides Japanese, do you use Anki in other fields of study? If yes, can you share your experience with us? So currently I don't use Anki in other fields of study, but I went through a long period of time where I did. Basically, once I learned about the SRS when I first started Japanese, it totally clicked with me, right? It made perfect sense. Oh, great. As long as I make flashcards for whatever I learn and I continue to review those flashcards, then I won't forget anything. On the other hand, if I don't make flashcards, then I will inevitably forget. And what's the point of learning something if you're eventually going to inevitably forget it? And so it just felt like I was going to, I felt like I wanted to use Anki for everything that I was going to learn. And it also felt like trying to learn without Anki would almost be meaningless. And so when I took, for example, psychology classes and biology classes at college, I made Anki cards for the content of those classes. And when I studied Japanese history, I made cards for that. And there was a lot of other subjects that I studied a little bit of that I tried to make cards for. But really what I realized eventually is that for most subjects that you study, Anki is just not very useful. And this is basically because fundamentally, Anki only allows you to remember disconnected facts. And for most subjects, in order to have an actual holistic understanding, you need more than just disconnected facts. You need to know how the facts all interrelate with each other. And the SRS is just really bad at helping you remember that type of thing. Because it's not linear, And Anki can really only help you with either individual facts, or even if you try to make cards that help you connect the different individual facts, it ends up just being a linear, you're limited to linear lines of reasoning, and a lot of times that's just not how knowledge works in the real world. Let me try to get more concrete so it's easier to understand what I'm talking about. So basically, when I was studying when I was studying Japanese history, I made a bunch of cards to remember who different people were in Japanese history and to remember what the big events were, and tried to make cards for what led up to those events and things like that. And although I continued to review the cards and I never forgot the answer to those cards, it felt like as time went on, my actual understanding of how Japanese history actually worked and how it played out just got blurrier and blurrier, and it got to the point where I felt like I couldn't really remember what actually happened. All I knew was just these disconnected facts, like, oh yeah, there's this guy like Sogano Soshi or whatever, or like Shotoku Taishi, and I could kind of maybe tell you one thing that he did, and I could tell you roughly when he lived and stuff, but couldn't really remember the story aspect of it, right? When you really read history, it plays out like a story. It's like, first there was this, and there was this, and these two things led to that thing, and then this other thing led to that thing, and it didn't really feel like that anymore. And so it kind of felt pointless. It was just like, well, what's the point of just knowing all these disconnected facts when I feel like I don't really understand the story of history? It felt like it wasn't going to help me with my real life. And also because of that, repping the cards got more and more painful, because it was like I could tell that I couldn't remember how this fit into everything else, but I didn't, just because a card came up, I couldn't go and reread a chapter of a book to help me refresh my memory, right? And so over time, it was almost like the cards just reminded me of how I kind of pretty much forgot what actually happened. And once I kind of realized this problem where if you only make cards for individual facts, then you forget how the facts connect with each other, then I tried to make cards that actually connected the facts, where I was like, there would be a card explain the series of events that led to, this happening in Japanese history. And these cards were so painful to rep because they required me to recall so many things. I just have to sit there and be like, okay, so first there was this guy, and they were dissatisfied with the current political situation because of these reasons. And then this other guy came along and blah, 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 blah. And it would take me 3 minutes of just recalling stuff to be able to answer the card. And then maybe I forgot a few facts or whatever. And that kind of worked, but it was so painful. Every time those cards came up inside, I would be like, no, this sucks. It's like torture trying to answer these cards. And it still wasn't really the same, because I only became able to answer the, recall the history in those little chunks of linear, events. And it wasn't the same as after you just finish reading the chapter of the book and you see it kind of holistically from as a story. It wasn't really like that. And there was also still a sense that my understanding was slowly fading with time. Now it was just fading a little more slowly. And so it really just felt kind of counterproductive. And I just realized that when you really think about the cost of trying to SRS something like history, it takes a lot of time to actually make the cards and review the cards. And you could probably just do a lot more studying in that same time that you're trying to SRS anything. And so I kind of just slowly started to understand that if you had two groups of people, and one group of people read 2 books on Japanese history and then SRS'd those 2 books, and then another group of people in the same amount of time read 4 books on Japanese history, the group who read 4 books on Japanese, like, and then would say you fast forward a year. The group who read 4 books on Japanese history are going to understand Japanese history better at the end of the year than the group that read 2 books and tried to SRS it. And that's just because, basically, when you really understand something, you don't actually forget it that quickly, right? Like, you forget the details, like, you'll forget the specific names and the specific dates, but you'll remember the overarching series of events. And that's what's really important in life. Like, if the whole point of knowing Japanese history is understanding roughly, like, how did Japanese history play out and get to and reach the point it is today, right? So you can understand Japanese people better and understand the type of things that can happen in different events in history. It's not important to know exactly who was who and who was the prime minister at this time or who was the emperor at this time and exactly what date this thing happened. That really is pretty much totally meaningless and irrelevant. And if you ever wanted to know that, you can look it up on Google in a second. So going out of your way to do a lot of work to maintain that with flashcards just seems like a waste of time. And I basically felt the same thing with psychology, where, like, it was good for memorizing the names of concepts like confirmation bias and like self-helping bias or whatever. It was good for memorizing just those things, but it wasn't really good for maintaining like a big picture understanding of human psychology or the history of psychology or anything like that. And over time, it just felt like my understandings of the concepts were continuing to fade, even though I was continuing to do my reps, because the flashcards I made couldn't totally encapsulate all the knowledge. And also, it just took so much time to be repping. Like, I was repping those psychology and those biology cards forever, and it just became more and more like clear that it was a waste of time because I didn't really even understand those subjects. And so I kind of just realized eventually that for most things, it's better to just read a book on it, like read a couple books on it, and then not SRS it. And if you ever want to refresh, just reread the book. And that's going to lead you to have a lot more useful knowledge. And it's also just way less painful, because it's so painful, honestly, to go through the process of trying to make general knowledge into flashcards. Like, if you just want to remember a random fact and you're like, oh, I'm going to make a card for my friend's birthday, or I'm going to remember a card to learn this one idea, that's cool, and I think that's useful. But if you're trying to actually be like, oh, I'm going to try to use Anki to encapsulate the knowledge of biology so that as long as I keep doing my reps, I will continue to perfectly remember biology. If you try to do that type of thing, which is what I was trying to do, it just, in practice, it doesn't work out, and it just ends up becoming a very painful endeavor. And so that's another thing, is that even if it did work, I don't even know if it'd be worth it, just because that burden of just having more and more cards, and then that feeling that your understanding of the big picture is fading as you're just memorizing these disconnected facts, and yeah, it was just pretty bad. And so I would say, on the other hand, things that, like, if you're learning a subject where you do have to memorize a lot of disconnected facts, then Anki probably would help you. Like, for example, I think medical students use Anki a lot, and that makes sense because they have a lot of just disconnected facts that they have to remember. And so I think that makes sense. And like language learning, right? We're basically using Anki to memorize a bunch of disconnected facts, which are the meanings of words. And then immersion ties those together, and we're constantly doing immersion and tie it together. And so I think if you are studying a subject where you have to memorize a ton of stuff and there's a real life component, Anki could be good, because you could use Anki for the individual facts, and then you have the real life component to tie it together. But the problem is that Anki on its own is never going to be able to really maintain knowledge. It can only be a supplement to actually engaging with the topic, is, that's kind of my conclusion. And so, like, yeah, and then there's just the stress of it as well. Because, I mean, there's also just the kind of paradox where if you're actually engaging in a subject regularly, then you're going to end up remembering everything you need to know about that subject just naturally, right? Like, if you talk to an actual biologist, he's going to know everything he needs to know about biology, and he probably never used Anki, and that's because he's engaging with biology every single day. He's constantly reading papers, and he's constantly looking things up, and so he's able to remember everything he needs, so he doesn't need Anki. On the other hand, if you took some random guy off the street who just wanted to have a basic understanding of biology, well, he probably doesn't engage enough with biology to maintain knowledge of all the little details, but at the same time, he doesn't need to maintain knowledge of all the little details because he's not a biologist, right? And so for him, as long as he can just use Google to look up a specific detail whenever he needs it, then practically speaking, that's totally fine. And so it's either you don't need to know the facts, or you do need to know all the little facts, but you're not going to have trouble with that because due to the nature of your life or your work, you're going to be engaging with it enough to remember it naturally anyway. And so it kind of is like, well, where does Anki fit in, right? It's for a very few things. And so I would say, getting caught up in trying to remember tons of little facts can be a big kind of rabbit hole and a big waste of time because realistically speaking, no one's impressed when you know a bunch of random facts, like the exact dates that something happened, and it doesn't actually benefit your life in any way because you can just Google those things and find them out in a few seconds anyway. And so I think it's better overall to focus on the big picture when you're just doing general learning, and you don't really need Anki for that because your brain's already pretty good at remembering the big picture as long as you learn it holistically by just reading a few books on the subject. So and then I would say if you're just trying to pass classes in school and you don't actually care about the big picture understanding, then it can be useful as well. But the thing is, like, what I think basically happens, like, for example, if you're going to use Anki to help you pass a biology class in school, let's say you go to the lectures, you listen to the lectures, and then you actually understand a topic. And then you make cards for that lecture, and the cards don't completely cover the content of the lecture, but it covers like 80% of it. And basically you're making like 80% of the disconnected facts you put into Anki, and then you're just naturally remembering how those facts are connected because you got that through the lecture. So, but when you're doing those reps for the first few months, the reps themselves are basically going to help you remember the disconnected facts, and they're also going to, every time you do the reps, you're going to be just remembering the big picture and how they're connected. And so your understanding of the big picture is going to be maintained through that. And so then maybe you get to the end of the term, you take the final and you ace it because the cards allowed you to maintain your big picture understanding just because you were thinking about it every time you were doing your reps. And also the reps themselves helped you remember the details of the minutia. But what would happen is when you can, like, if you rep that for another year, then the intervals would get so big that you would forget the big picture in between the time that you saw one rep and another rep. And it would eventually get to the point where you only remember the individual facts and you forget the big picture. And then because you have forgotten the big picture, the individual facts become meaningless to you. So I would say in the short term, Anki can work really well if you're just using it to pass your classes and get good grades and you're not really concerned about long-term retention of the actual subject. And so so I would definitely recommend it to students, who, if you're in college and you're trying to efficiently pass your classes, that can be good, but basically just delete your deck at the end of the term because it's going to get very, very painful and meaningless if you continue to rep those decks long term. So basically, those are all my thoughts on using Anki for other fields of study. I pretty much just plan on using it for languages and then just reading nonfiction books to grow my knowledge in other subjects. And if I need to brush up on a topic, I'll just reread a book. And when you think about it, all of the most, brilliant intellectuals throughout all of history, they never used Anki, and they were able to remember everything they really needed, right? And so I don't really think you need Anki to remember meaningful things. So Alex Rogers asks, have you ever been skeptical about meditation? If so, what changed your mind? Not really. I mean, ever since the first time I heard about the idea that you could get better at concentrating through sitting down and practicing concentrating, that made perfect sense because in my experience, you get better at whatever you practice doing. And so it just made intuitive sense. Like, oh, if you sit down and you practice concentrating on your breath, and every time that your mind wanders, you just bring it back and you just keep practicing, you'll get better and better at concentrating. That just made perfect sense. And also, once I got interested in it from that, just on that basic level, then I learned that there was a lot of scientific studies actually showing that there are like measurable positive changes in your brain when you regularly meditate, and that it was, really successful at helping people quit addictions and things like that. And so there wasn't really anything to be skeptical about in my mind. And then later on when I did psychedelics and I had experiences of profound altered states of consciousness, then it made even more sense that maybe there was a little bit more to this meditation thing because I already had firsthand experience with how it's possible to experience states of consciousness that you would never be able to imagine before actually experiencing them. And so then I thought, oh, maybe, those Buddhist people, maybe they really have something going on over there. And I became more interested in it. So I was never really skeptical. I don't really even, it's kind of like being skeptical about exercise, right? It's like, is anyone skeptical about that exercise is good for you? Not really. So in my mind, it's kind of the same thing. Alex Rogers also asks, I have a question about shadowing. How do you shift your attention between the voice on the recording and your own voice? It's not very clear to me what to do when I'm repeating the phrase that I've just heard while listening to the next phrase at the same time. Should I focus on my own voice and give myself feedback, or should I focus on the phrase that I'm about to repeat? So basically, the idea with shadowing is that you're doing both at the same time. You're kind of partitioning your attention, and you're listening to what you're about to say in a second, and then you're also listening to your own voice coming out, and you're trying to find the right balance. So your attention isn't actually shifting back and forth. You're trying to hold your attention in a certain way that you're doing both at the same time. Like, imagine someone doing simultaneous interpretation where they're both translating, saying what they heard a second ago, and they're listening to what they're going to be saying in the next moment. And so I think if you're having trouble with this, it's just a matter of getting more practice and just kind of figuring out. It's kind of like riding a bike, right? Once it clicks, but before it clicks, it hasn't clicked yet. And so you just got to keep practicing it, and you'll know when you're doing it right. But basically the idea is that you're listening to both, and you can do that. It's totally possible, right? Now, of course, when you're listening to both the recording and your voice at the same time, you're not listening as attentively to either one as you could be, because if you were just listening to your voice, you would be able to focus more intently than if you were listening to both. And if you were listening to just the recording, you can listen more intently. But the idea is that when you're listening just intently to the recording, well, that's just active listening, and you should be doing that anyway. And then if you were only attentively listening to your own voice, well, then you wouldn't be hearing the recording, and so you couldn't get the effect of hearing where you're off, right? Which is the idea. And so that's why you have to listen to both at the same time. And of course, yeah, you're not fully listening to either one, but that's just how the technique works, is that you're listening to both and then trying to see where they're different. So if it hasn't really clicked yet, I would just say just stick with it for a few more weeks, and I would wager that you'll eventually figure it out. Just keep playing with it, keep playing with what you're doing with your attention, and I would wager that you'll figure it out pretty soon. So Friendly Samode asks, "Hey Matt, I am at a pretty good level in Japanese where I can read novels decently and enjoy many forms of media. However, I have decided to not go to Japan because it is personally a deficit for me in every way: job opportunities, cultural difference, and being Chinese American. I am content with living my life in America because by default English is easier for me and there is more of a convenience in terms of life opportunities. My friends, however, see this as a missed opportunity and see me as having wasted my time learning Japanese. Although I don't disagree with this entirely, I consume a lot of anime culture and play a lot of Japanese video games, so learning Japanese has improved the weeb life. My question is, how would you convince someone that you don't need to go to Japan in more concrete terms? Like, Japan doesn't have this, or it would be harder for me to blend in, or having less job opportunities, and etc. Can you compare the countries of Japan and America in terms of quality of life, or in terms of life quality?" So this is a weird question. So the actual question part of your comment starts with, how would you convince someone that you don't need to go to Japan? Well, why are you assuming that I would convince someone of that in the first place? Right? I think that's a very odd sentiment to have. I would never try to convince someone that they don't need to go to Japan, right? That's not something that I would do. And basically the deal is, it should be pretty self-evident that you don't need to go to Japan because you don't need to do anything, right? If you're living in America, then you're a free citizen and you can go wherever you can totally have the right to continue staying in America as long as you have a green card or a visa or whatever. And so you don't you don't need to go to Japan. That should be self-evident. Now the question is, should you want to go to Japan or not? I mean, that's totally up to you. Like, why should I be the one to tell you what's best for your life? Whether you're the only one who can decide whether it would be a plus to your life to go to Japan or a negative to your life. Your friends can't know that. I can't know that. You can't know that, but you're the one who has to decide, and you're the one who's going to know better than anyone else. And so if you really just have zero interest in going to Japan, then you probably shouldn't go. Now, if you truly had zero interest in going to Japan, I would guess that you wouldn't have even asked this question, because if you just knew that you had zero interest in going to Japan and that was not on the table in any way, shape, or form, then you wouldn't really care that your friends would be saying that you should go to Japan or whatever, right? The fact that your friends saying that bothers you kind of tells me that maybe it is still on the table and you're not totally sure. Now, it kind of seems like the way that I'm interpreting your question, it kind of seems that, yeah, you have this conflict, should I go to Japan, should I not? But you're leaning towards the side of not going to Japan, and you're asking me to somehow solve your cognitive dissonance by saying, like, yeah, I have this cognitive dissonance where I want to do A and B, but they conflict with each other, but I want B to be true, so can you, convince me that B is true so I can get rid of this dissonance that I have? And I'm not going to be able to do that for you. If this is what's going on for you, then you just gotta make your decision and stop thinking about it, because you only live once and can't time travel. So you just gotta decide, what are you gonna do with your life at this point? And I mean, I don't think you were asking me to give you to try to find points that America is better than Japan so that it would be easier to solve your cognitive dissonance. But I mean, honestly, this seems a little bit silly. Can you compare them in terms of life quality? I mean, come on, they're both first world countries. There's not going to be any meaningful difference in life quality on the surface, right? Like in Japan, you can, if you get a good apartment, it's going to have air conditioning. There's going to be grocery stores nearby, you're going to have a refrigerator, you're going to have electricity, you're going to have good internet. And so, I mean, I don't know, what do you want me to say, man? Honestly, I think this question is a little silly. What I would say is that consider the possibility that going to Japan could be a potential growth opportunity, right? Living in a foreign country that has a completely different culture is going to broaden your view of the world. It's going to deepen your understanding of human beings, and it will very likely enrich your life in ways that you currently might not be able to predict. And so rather than just living in the same place within the same culture your whole life, living in different places and experiencing different things is probably going to lead to more personal growth and more meaningful experiences and a more enriched life. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I want to go back and live in Japan is really for that. And you don't have to live in Japan forever. You can go live in Japan for a year and then actually see if you like it or not. And then you'll know for sure whether you want to spend more time there or go back. And if you do that, you probably won't regret it, because now you'll know for sure whether what you wanted to do, right? And if you go and live in Japan for let's say 2 or 3 years, that's not a failure, right? It's not like you're trying to find your final resting place and once you get there, then you just stay there your whole life. That's not really the point of life, right? The point of life is, I mean, I'm not going to say what the point of life is, but I mean, if you just go and live someplace for a number of years and you have a bunch of interesting experiences, that's totally valuable in its own right. And so, I mean, it kind of seems like also in your question, you're posing this huge dichotomy of I either have to live in America my whole life or Japan my whole life. Which one should I do? Whereas that's totally not the case. And so, I mean, yeah, there's so many different factors to take into account. I definitely can't make this decision for you, and maybe I was able to provide some sort of useful information to you, but I don't really know, because honestly, your questions seemed a little bit misguided to me. So Jeffrey Downing asks, How much conscious effort do you put into your accent when speaking Japanese? Phonetics, intonation, pitch accent, etc. None really, because there's simply not enough time. When you're actually having a conversation with someone, or you're trying to express a complicated idea, there's not enough time to be actually thinking about phonetics. It's just not possible, right? Just like you can't meaningfully think about grammar either unless you're speaking extremely slowly. And so I pretty much just have to I just speak, and I just hope that what will come out of my mouth will sound good. And if what comes out of my mouth isn't good, or, like I make a certain mistake phonetics wise, right? Which that just tells me I need more practice so that when I do speak with, just off the cuff, it comes out correctly the first time. It's not really a matter of like trying to modulate what you're doing in real time, because that's just simply not really realistic in my opinion. Now, there are subconscious routines that play out related to pitch accent. Like, for example, think about what it's like to drive a car, right? A lot of times, if you're an experienced driver and you've been driving for a long time, you can have conversations while you're driving, and you can listen to music while you're driving, and basically almost no conscious really thought is going towards the driving. But there are things related to driving happening in your consciousness, right? You can still see like, okay, I see the light, I'm going to do this, I'm going to turn on my signal, whatever. And so it kind of feels like that related to pitch accent, where there's some part of my mind that I can feel that is kind of doing things related to pitch accent, like, oh, this word has this pitch, so say it like this, and this pattern has this pitch, so say it like that. But it's not really conscious. It just happens automatically, and I couldn't even stop it if I wanted to. But I can still feel that is playing out, and it feels like for a native speaker that probably wouldn't be playing out. It would be completely unconscious instead of subconscious. So subconscious is kind of like this place in between conscious and unconscious. If it's conscious, it means you actually have control over it. Whereas if it's unconscious, it means you're not even aware of it at all. It's like completely invisible to you. And subconscious is this kind of in-between point where you can kind of feel it happening, but you don't really have control over it. And that is kind of what I feel like is going on related to pitch accent. And there's also just other routines. Like I'll just notice like if my vowel sounded weird, I'll automatically be like, oh, that sounded weird. Maybe say it more like this next time. But it's just all automatic. It's just like driving, it's just your body just does it, and in a way you don't even know how you're doing it. And so that's more how it feels. There's just, when it comes to actually doing it consciously, like trying to control it, there's just not enough time, in my opinion. So Thomas Makowski asks, do you think immersion at first through programs like Pimsleur or Assimil is a good idea, or whether native media should be preferred from the start? So definitely native media should be preferred from the start. I'm not too familiar with Assimil, but Pimsleur in particular I've listened to, and I mean it's inferior to native media for multiple reasons. The first reason is that when you listen to a Pimsleur track, it's like more than half of it is English, literally. Like it's like 2/3 English, 1/3 target language. And so just on that alone, you're getting 2/3 less immersion than if you were actually just listening to native media that was native media the whole time. And the other thing is that you're getting exposed to like the same conversation over and over and over again, and it's like kind of artificially slowed down. And so it's like your brain's getting a very small sample to analyze the language from. And I think that that's not as useful as giving your brain a more rich sample to analyze the language from and let it run its own pattern recognition and figure out the phonetic system and the grammar and things like that on its own. That's kind of what the brain is built to do. And the reason why I think people like things like Pimsleur is because it gives you the illusion that you're making more progress than you are. Because what Pimsleur basically does is it takes one preset conversation that's extremely unnatural and contrived and really clear, like, hello, how are you doing today? I am doing great. How are you doing? I'm doing great too. It's like that type of super fake conversation that's way cleaner and clearer than any real life conversation would be. And then they train you over the course of like 30 lessons to understand this one conversation, like bit by bit. And because it's the same exact conversation that they're training you to understand with like little tiny remixes to it, you do become able to understand it. And then it feels like, oh wow, I'm understanding like a real Chinese conversation or like a real Japanese conversation. And then you get the sense of, oh wow, this is working, like I'm getting better. But it's not that you actually are getting better at your target language, it's that you've just learned to understand this one contrived conversation. And if you actually go and try to listen to real native Japanese, you're not going to understand very much at all. And so I think, of course, if you just listen to real native Japanese or whatever your target language is from the beginning, it's the reverse, right? You don't feel like you're making as much progress because, of course, even if you do make a lot of progress, you're still not understanding the majority of what you're listening to. But in reality, your brain's getting better at parsing the sounds and parsing the grammar and things like that at a really rapid pace. It's just hard for you to notice it yet. And so, I would definitely say expose yourself to the real thing from the beginning so that your brain can start getting used to the real thing, because at the end of the day, the real thing is what you're trying to understand. And if you feel like Pimsleur is really helping you, consider the possibility that that's more of an illusion, because at the end of the day, you have to always measure your progress using native media, right? How much are you understanding of native media? That's the only true way to measure whether you're progressing or not. And also just make the note that it's like we all learned our first language through listening to real natural speech. And so I think that's what the brain's meant to do, is just be overloaded with real input. That's how it's going to figure it out. That's what it's programmed to do. So Robert Wicktaker asks, is it really necessary to immerse while doing lazy kanji? So he wrote LK. So we've changed the name of lazy kanji to recognition RTK. And the acronym is RRTK. So is it really necessary to immerse while doing RRTK? I've been immersing for about 2 hours a day, but I don't feel like I'm getting anything from it. It's funny that this question comes right after the previous question, huh? Would it be more beneficial? By the way, I just said, you guys might think that I purposely did that, but I didn't do that. That's why I just pointed out, because I just realized it's a coincidence. I was just sorting the questions based off how many likes they have, and it just so happened that this one came after the previous one. But anyway, so is it really necessary to immerse while doing RRTK? I've been immersing for about 2 hours a day, but I don't feel like I'm getting anything from it. Wouldn't it be more beneficial to use the time to focus on finishing the kanji as fast as possible and start immersing when doing the sentences? So I also would recommend you to go and read the immersion section of the MIA Japanese Quick Start Guide, because I talk a lot about why in MIA we recommend that you start doing immersion from the beginning. And it's basically because, hypothetically, you could memorize thousands of words in your target language, and if you haven't listened to your target language for hundreds of hours, you're still going to understand virtually nothing. And this is because language is just so fast, and it contains different, so many different sounds that your brain's not used to hearing in that order and things like that. It takes your brain hundreds of hours of listening to the language before it can start to be able to just parse the sounds and actually be able to put the, vowels and consonants into syllables and syllables into words and then words into grammar structures and things like this. And so what you're doing for the first few hundred hours of your immersion is you're just letting your brain adjust to the sound system. And this happens automatically just through you listening and trying to pay attention. And there's no other way to make it happen, right? But there's no way to get to the point where your brain can parse the sound system and be able to actually pick out full words and parse together grammar without listening to the language for hundreds of hours. There's no shortcut. And so what you're really doing during the recognition RTK phase is two things. First of all, you're learning to recognize the kanji. Second of all, you're learning to recognize the sounds, basically, right? You're learning to parse the sound system. And so that's just as important, because once you start doing sentences, if you haven't listened to the language at all, well, you're still not going to be able to actually hear any of the things that you're learning through the sentences, right? So, you could just start listening to the language by the time you start doing sentences, but your progress is going to be a lot slower than if you already had, put in a few hundred hours of immersion. And so the other thing is that shouldn't you just do kanji more? Well, first of all, there's passive immersion, which is pretty much free, right? Because you can listen to the language while you cook and clean. You can't learn kanji while you cook and clean. And so you should definitely be doing passive immersion if you can, because that's just free benefit, and that's just going to mean that you progress faster than you would otherwise. Now, when it comes to active immersion versus doing more kanji, well, and really what it comes down to is that you can only learn so many kanji a day. Like I wouldn't recommend ever doing more than 30, because if you're doing more than 30 kanji a day, then that means that either you're spending a lot of time memorizing kanji and doing reps, which is not a good thing, because that's just going to make you, you don't want to get to that point where you're associating Anki with pain and suffering, right? Like if you watch the interview with Chris, he tried to do kanji way too quickly, and he ended up just associating the Anki with pain and suffering, and then he didn't use Anki as much for his entire experience learning Japanese. Now that worked out all right for him, but ideally this wouldn't happen, right? Ideally, you would have a positive relationship with Anki, and you would continue to have it be your companion throughout your Japanese learning journey. And so I would say it's just a really dangerous path to go down, trying to do tons of cards a day, because I've seen it lead to failure in so many cases, right? You end up having 300 reps a day, you miss a day, now you have 600 reps, you're not able to finish it, and then it's just this slippery slope down into Anki hell. And also, if you try to learn too many things a day, then your retention rate is going to get worse, because there's going to be more memory interference. And that's basically the other possibility, is that if you are learning more than 30 kanji a day and you're not spending a lot of time on it, that means that basically you're rushing through it, which means your retention rate is going to suck. You're not going to learn them well. You're going to have lots of memory interference, and then you're going to come out with a worse result in the end. And so that's why I would say, like, if you go through RRTK at a rate of 30 a day, I think it only takes like a month, right? Let's see. So, because there's only 1,000. So yeah, it would take you like a month and a couple days if you did 30 a day. So that's not that long, right, at all, unless you're extremely impatient. And so I would say do that, and then spend the rest of your time immersing, because now you're setting yourself up to, at the end of that month, jump into sentences and actually be able to start understanding a lot more of your immersion, because you have already laid the foundation of being able to parse the sounds. And also, you can learn a lot through immersion, even without minding sentences. And I talk about that in the Quick Start Guide too. And I talked about that earlier in this guide, right? If you're actually looking things up that pop out at you, you can increase your understanding quite rapidly just through immersion. So if you have the mindset where all the real learning happens in the SRS and immersion is just kind of some supplement, then that's going to be really harmful to, your journey learning Japanese, because immersion is where all the action happens, right? You should get into the mindset that whenever you're immersing, that's an opportunity to learn, and you don't need the SRS to learn. That's just a supplement that can help. And so, I mean, your question, you phrased it as if like you wrote, is it necessary to immerse? Well, it's not necessary to do anything, right? You can do literally whatever you want, but we designed MIA to be the most efficient path possible. And what we think is the most efficient path is to do active immersion alongside the recognition RTK, probably with about 50-50 ratio, and then also doing passive immersion. And then by the time that you start sentences, you'll have a foundation in reading, and you'll have a foundation in listening, and you'll be able to start benefiting from sentence mining much more quickly. Okay, so Link asks, when I'm repping my Japanese deck on a lot of cards, maybe most of them, I don't understand the +1 word, so it would be now would be called the target word, right away. I hear the word, I know it is the target word, but I don't know what it means yet. I do audio cards, so when I start hearing the audio, I start remembering what was happening in that particular scene of the show that I was watching. So then, after not understanding the word, I start thinking about that scene and the context, and only then, after thinking about how the word would fit in that context, I can infer/remember what the word was supposed to mean. This happens to a different degree depending on the card. Sometimes this happens strongly enough that I end up failing the card, because I feel like I would never have understood that word if it was in any slightly different context. Sorry. Is that something that everyone experiences, or should I do something about it? So basically you're saying that when you rep, initially you don't really remember what the target word means until you recall the original context that you saw the sentence in, and then you're able to understand it. So I would say that, yeah, that's a super common experience, and I pretty much talk about this in my video called The Role of the SRS, Part 1. So if you haven't seen that, I would recommend going and checking that out. But basically, to a certain degree, yeah, this is inevitable, because that's just kind of the nature of how the SRS works, right? Like if you learn a word in the SRS, it's going to form context-dependent knowledge. And when you see it in different contexts outside the SRS, that knowledge isn't going to immediately transfer. It's going to take a few times of coming across it in the wild and then not remembering it and then looking it up and then realizing, oh yeah, I have a card for this, and then drawing those connections to get to the point where you have context-independent knowledge. And so, by the way, did I say context-independent knowledge a second ago? No, I think I did. I don't think I messed up. If I messed up, sorry. So yeah, and to a certain extent, that's totally normal and inevitable. But also, if it's really bad, like you said, you should just fail the card. Like if you had to like rack your brain and feel like, okay, so when in this scene that was happening, which means this word probably means something like this. If you had to do that, then just fail the card. And if you see the card more often, then you'll end up knowing the word better and having better recall of it. So in a way, maybe if this is happening to you for a lot of your cards, then maybe be more quick to fail the card. Because if you're using low-key Anki, the cost of failing a card is very low, right? Basically what happens is you see the card more frequently for a short period of time, and then it goes back to you seeing it not so frequently. So really just in a way, it's good to be quick to fail cards so that you can learn them well. And then once you learn them well, then you can let the intervals get really big. Rather than the approach of always pressing good even when you don't know the card very well, and therefore you continue to not know it very well, and then it gets blurrier and blurrier over time, right? It's better to just really nail it in at the beginning, and then let it grow. But at the same time, you have to balance that with correct expectations in the sense of, at the end of the day, the SRS is never going to be enough to help you master a word. Really, you're just trying to create the mental dictionary entry. That's the main purpose. And then it's only through coming across it subsequently in your immersion that you're going to actually be able to fully master and acquire the word. So I would definitely recommend checking out that video, The Role of the SRS, because that will help you kind of contextualize what we're really doing with the SRS in relation to the rest of learning Japanese. So Vro asks, do you have any recommendations for Japanese history books / resources? So yeah, so I already mentioned in this video that I studied Japanese history, and I actually found that most Japanese history books sucked. Like, actually, I already pulled a book of one that I liked off my shelf, but here, like, these type of books. So you can see they're just general Japanese history books. They're all just Nihonshi. This one's 面白いほどよくわかる日本史、歴史が面白いシリーズ深い日本史 and 早わかり日本史. So like these are all just meant like to be a complete introduction to Japanese history if you don't know anything about it, and it pretty much covers all like from like the Stone Age all the way up to the present pretty much. And they have like lots of pictures and lots of diagrams, and you think that it would be really great, but in reality it's not, because it only spends a little tiny like paragraph on each event. And so you only get like, in this year this happened, in that year that happened, blah 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 blah. And so it's hard to, for me, I would read it and I would instantly forget it. It would be like totally meaningless for me. It kind of just, like going back to the Anki thing, it kind of felt like disconnected facts because they're trying to shove too much stuff into one book. It's like, if you try to shove 2,000 years of history into like one book, it's just, it means that you're not going into any detail at all. And what I learned studying Japanese history is that the more detail you go into, the easier it is to remember and understand, because the more that the dots get connected in your mind, right? Like, because if you're just reading the bullet point summary, then that it's just like, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and you don't really know any of the why. You only know the what. Whereas if you go into detail and you understand it, then it becomes like a story, right? You learn the characters, you learn the intentions of the characters, you learn why things happened and exactly what led to the next thing, and that naturally leads you to be able to remember it very well, just like you can remember the plot of a TV show that you like, you know? It starts to feel like that. And so I actually found that these type of books didn't really help me understand Japanese history at all, whereas the books that really helped me were books by this guy Izawa Motohiko. So I can put that into the description. He has a lot of books on Japanese history, and I read a bunch of books by him, and they really helped me understand Japanese history as like a story, because he's like a really good writer, and also he doesn't necessarily tell you the consensus of like the exact same thing that would happen in the history book. He kind of has his own take and his own theories on a bunch of things in Japanese history. And he kind of reads between the lines. And he was like, yeah, a lot of scholars think this, but that's kind of stupid because there's this other evidence that they're not taking seriously. And so you're not necessarily getting the same interpretation you would get from a textbook, but you actually end up understanding the whys. And it's actually interesting and enjoyable. And he just also, he writes in very normal, clear language. And so he doesn't assume that you already know stuff. And so it's just like, yeah, so back in the day, there was this thing called this. It was like there was this system where there was like the Okami, and the Okami it's kind of like a prime minister today. And so it's like blah, 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 blah. And what I just said isn't true. But he'll explain it in terms of things that exist today so that you can understand what was going on back in the day. And so, yeah, I would recommend he has like 1 million books out. So like just read whatever you can get your hands on or whatever you're interested in. And yeah, that would be my tip is if you're going to SRS things, only SRS the names of people, because that's the difficult thing, is that there's like insane kanji readings for names of historical figures that are like completely disconnected to anything that exists today. It's like you could never guess them. And sometimes on one kanji there will be like a super long name, and it's just weird. So that could be a good thing to SRS, is just the names of the figures. And then and any other names that come up, like for example like Asuka Jidai, like the names of the different periods. Like I would memorize just the readings of the names, because then you'll have mental dictionary entries that will be easier to fill in when you actually read the text. But I wouldn't try to, like I said earlier, I wouldn't try to actually SRS the content. But yeah, there's that. And then also documentaries are good for history, and also period dramas are good. So like what I think would be the best way to do is, like, if you're going to get into Japanese history, like go choose a period of time that you want to learn about, and then read some of this guy's books on that period, and then maybe watch like a documentary or two, and then try to find a period drama that takes place during that period. And then you'll get a really good feel for that period of Japanese history and what it was like and what went on and stuff. And in case you don't know, a period drama is a historical drama. Basically, it's like a drama that takes place within a specific period in Japanese history, and it actually like tells the tale of historical events. So it's like based on facts, you could say, with of course fiction mixed in. And they're made by NHK generally. They've been going on every year for like decades, and they have a really big budget, so there's some good ones. So Jordan Calendry asks, "Hi Matt, I have a question about textbooks. It seems natural for me to use a lots of grammar resources to learn a new language, because in France we love grammar and grammar exceptions. Do you think a textbook fully in Japanese, like Minna no Nihongo, can be useful, or do you think it's a complete waste of time?" Well, so in MIA, I recommend reading through a grammar guide towards the beginning of the process, because I think that it's useful because it can improve your comprehension. But there's a really strong practice versus theory issue when it comes to learning grammar as a beginner. And I go into detail on this in the MIA Japanese Quick Start Guide, so check that out if you want to understand more deeply. But basically, as a beginner, there's a hard ceiling to how deeply you can understand Japanese grammar without actually acquiring the language. And so you can read through Take Him and you'll take a lot away, but you're not going to be able to understand it perfectly. Like, you're going to just have this idea about roughly how grammar works, but it's not going to be fully accurate. And you're just simply not going to be able to get more accurate than it's going to be after reading Take Him, until you actually start acquiring the language and understanding it intuitively. And so like that's how it works. And so at the beginning, it's useful to have some basic introduction to grammar to help you understand stuff. And after that, you're going to have to actually acquire some Japanese to intuitively get how grammar really works. And so Take Him is really good for that, because if you're a beginner in Japanese, you're not going to know Japanese yet. And so it's good that it's in English. So I don't really see how Minna no Nihongo or a fully Japanese textbook would fit into the process, because our goal is to acquire grammar. And that's an intuitive thing. And so you don't have to be thinking about grammar rules or things like that, because that's actually not very useful, because you're not able to really use grammar rules in actual conversation. And I never learned any grammar rules, and I can speak Japanese completely grammatically. I have many other friends who are the same. Now, it can be interesting to study Japanese grammar in Japanese after you've already reached basic fluency, just to kind of get a meta level understanding of Japanese. But if you're going to do that, I would recommend using a Japanese book written for Japanese people on Japanese grammar, where it's actually going to explain things fully fleshed out in detail and not use baby language and not explain it in a way assuming that the person isn't good at Japanese and things like that. And so I do think that can be useful. And it can also be useful to study Keigo once you're already advanced. But as a beginner, there's a limit of how much you can make use of grammar, and Teikim's going to give you all you need. And so, yeah, I don't really think that reading things like Minna no Nihongo is going to give you anything substantial. Now, it's not a complete waste of time, just because if Minna no Nihongo is written in Japanese, then, you know, if you're trying to acquire Japanese, anytime you're reading Japanese, that's not a waste of time. You're still benefiting from that. So reading Minna no Nihongo would still be beneficial in the sense that it's still immersion, but it's not going to be more beneficial than just reading a manga or reading a book on fire trucks or something, you know? And so, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a complete waste of time, but I don't think it's really going to have anything that you can't get from either Teikim or just general immersion. So, SB asks, you recommended from the RTK phase, you recommended immersion from the RTK phase, mostly so you can get used to the phonetic system. Should pitch accent not be considered part of the phonetic system? Wouldn't it be beneficial to start trying to understand pitch accent as early as possible? Not really. And the reason for this is that when I'm talking about getting used to the phonetic system, that's an unconscious thing. Like, when you listen to, for example, like let's say you listen to a foreign language you've never heard before, right? It's just going to sound like a blur of sounds. You're not going to be able to even really hear what consonants are being said, what vowels are being said, what syllables are being said, where one word ends and another word begins. It's really just going to sound like a chaotic blur. And now think about listening to your native language, right? You understand all of it, and you couldn't not understand it even if you wanted to. And now think about maybe your a target language that you're halfway you're halfway to fluency, right? You're not going to understand all of it, but it's going to sound very different to you than the language that you've never heard before, right? You're going to hear words, you're going to be able to hear syllables, you're going to hear some meaning, and so it's just going to sound different to you. And that's an unconscious thing. You listen to language, and then it sounds a certain way to you, consciously, subjectively. And you can't control how it sounds to you, right? It's just going to sound how it's going to sound. And so this process of getting used to the phonetic system through immersion from the very beginning, it's an unconscious process. I mean, you consciously pay attention to it, and that speeds up the process, but you're not really figuring anything out. It's really just the longer you listen, the more clearly you can hear what's going on. And so consciously studying pitch accent isn't going to affect that unconscious process of your unconscious mind becoming more and more able to parse the sound system, because your unconscious mind doesn't have access to whatever theoretical abstract ideas that you filled your brain with about pitch accent. And so it's not really going to do anything for you. Now, I think just having a very broad understanding of how pitch accent works, that could be useful, but actually trying to understand the nuances of it, like the rules of, like, okay, so there's two different types of verbs pitch accent wise, and on one type, when it's in the nai form, it drops before the na, and on the other one, it drops after the na. Like, that level of learning about pitch accent, it's not going to be beneficial to you because you're not going to be able to hear it. And being able to, like, pitch accent only starts to become useful once you start being able to hear it. And in order to become able to hear pitch accent, you have to have a basic understanding of Japanese. Like, you have to have already gotten to the point where you can understand spoken Japanese to a certain level. Otherwise, you don't stand a chance, right? It's like, basically, what you're not going to be able to, like, it's such a subtle thing exactly, you know, which pitch accent pattern a word's being pronounced as. If you're not even able to hear what word is being pronounced, you're never going to be able to hear what pitch accent pattern a word's being pronounced as, right? It's like trying to run before you can walk. And so really one way to think about it is that at the beginning of MIA, your goal is to learn to understand the language. And then later, you're trying to learn to produce the language. And so really at the beginning, your process of learning to understand the language more and more, that is mostly controlled by your unconscious mind. It's going to figure it out using its own tools and with its own agenda. And it's not really going to be, paying that much attention to what you're doing consciously. And so, it's at the beginning, your brain's not going to use pitch accent information to try to understand what's going on. And you consciously just having the knowledge that pitch accent is happening isn't really going to affect that process. And I experience the same thing with Chinese right now, basically, where in Chinese, I still don't understand that much. And I know about the tones, and I know what tones words are being pronounced as. And if I hear a word in isolation, I can hear the tone. But when I'm listening to full speed Chinese, my brain, I can feel that my knowledge about the tones isn't helping me understand at all. Because when I pick out a word that I know, it's my brain's just roughly picking out the vowels and consonants of it. And maybe my brain unconsciously has some notion of the tones, but it's disconnected from my conscious knowledge of it. I can intuitively understand that. And so it just seems like, reflecting on both my experience with pitch accent Japanese and my experience with tones in Chinese, in the beginning, being able to accurately hear the tones is like running. And I can't even walk yet in Chinese. And so it's just not relevant at all. I can just feel that it's not relevant. It's an experiential thing, so it's hard to explain. But basically, the best way I can explain it is that in order to be able to train yourself to hear pitch accent, then you have to already understand Japanese, be able to understand spoken Japanese, just like how you need to be able to walk to be able to learn how to run. And so because of this, learning about pitch accent isn't really going to do anything. But beyond a very basic level of just knowing, maybe you can start to try to notice it here or there. That's why I said, if you just learn, maybe just how the pitch accent works in the sense of, every word starts out high and it either stays high or it drops low. Once it drops low, it doesn't go back up. And so there's 4 basic patterns. Heibana, tamadaka, nakadaka, otaka. If you just learned that could be useful to just have in the back of your mind. But anything beyond that realistically isn't going to help you, because you need to be able to understand spoken Japanese as a prerequisite to begin to start to train yourself to actually hear the pitch patterns in real speech. And if you can't hear the pitch accent patterns in real speech, then what good is the knowledge, right? Because if you can't actually hear the patterns and you're just trying to use the knowledge of the patterns to produce Japanese when you speak, well, then you're just faking it, right? That's almost like you've never seen a dog before, but you read a description of a dog and now you're trying to draw the dog, right? It's like if you've never seen the dog before, your drawing is going to suck. And it's just like, if you can't hear the actual pitch accent patterns when you're listening to real Japanese, and you just have the conscious knowledge of what you think it's supposed to sound like, and then you're trying to say the Heiban words flat, and you're trying to say the go down when you say an Tamadaka word, then that's not actually going to make your Japanese sound any better. It's probably just going to make your Japanese sound really weird, because you're trying to pronounce things differently based off of knowledge, not based off of what you actually have heard before. And so, yeah, hopefully that answered your question. That's an important thing that I can see this is a question that's going to continue to arise in people's minds, so I'm going to have to get better at articulating my answer. But hopefully that made some sense. So Ego Plant asks, what do you think is the best way to deal with unknown readings? I'm basically already fluent at this point, but it's a problem I've always had when I was reading, and I never found a good way to deal with it. Basically, you see a word while reading and look it up in the dictionary only to find multiple readings with the same definition. There doesn't seem to be any good way to figure out which one is actually used. Take boketsu, for example. How are you supposed to know if it's pronounced boketsu or hakana if you found it while reading something without furigana? So basically, there's 2 main approaches to this. My approach was I would just make a mental note that I didn't know which one it was, and then I'd wait until I actually heard it pronounced in real life, and then I'd know. So in the case, you wrote boketsu, right? It's always boketsu. I've heard people say boketsu, boketsu horu. I've heard people say that, probably hundreds or thousands of times. I've never heard hakana. So I just know that it's boketsu. And then boketsu is way more frequent. So I just know that from experience, right? Just from continued immersion, because I heard it pronounced that way. So that was always my approach. And in a sense, if the word never comes up in your immersion, like in your spoken immersion, so you never hear it pronounced, then do you even really need to know how it's pronounced, right? Like, let's say there's this word that you literally are never going to hear pronounced in your entire life, and because of that, you're probably never going to pronounce it either, because why would you be pronouncing something that you're never ever going to hear someone else pronounce, right? Then, in a sense, it literally doesn't matter which one it is. And in a sense, neither one is wrong, because the fact that it's in the dictionary means that that reading does exist, right? And so, in a way, that would be my approach, is just wait until you actually hear it pronounced, and then say it that way. If you never hear it pronounced ever, then you probably don't need to know it in the first place. But if you really want to know, just use a frequency list. That's the easy answer, right? Like, look it up in a frequency list, because frequency lists have readings. Like the frequency list that I normally use for Japanese has the kanji and the reading, and so you can actually see which reading is more common. And this is actually going to be a problem that's going to be fixed with the MI dictionary add-on, because we made a system where whenever you look up a word, the frequency is right next to it. And so you could look up bulketsu and you could see that, like bulketsu. Actually, let me try it now and see. You guys won't be able to see it, but I can. I'll tell you what the result is. 1 star means it's above 60,000. Zero star means it's above 100,000. So here you can see that bulketsu is 1 star, Hakan is 0 star, which means you know that bulketsu is the more common one. So if you download the MI dictionary add-on, then you can start doing this as well, or you can just download your own frequency list and figure it out. So that would be the most surefire way, I would say. So Ethan O'Brien asks, "Hi Matt, thanks for all the work you and Yoga have been doing recently. It's making life much easier and more interesting studying nowadays. My question is related to pitch accent. I've read the NHK Accent Dictionary and I'm fairly confident I know the rules and theory explained there, and I've spent a few weeks noticing the pitch accent as I add new sentences to my Anki deck. One topic that I think wasn't covered in the NHK Accent Dictionary but is fairly obvious from listening to native speech is the phenomena of pitch accent phrases. A number of words in the sentence which only contain one drop rather than each individual word in the sentence having its own drop. Obviously enough, if each word had a drop in isolation, if each word which had a drop in isolation had a drop in the sentence, the end of the sentence would be too low to pronounce in many cases. I only have limited experience with this, but would it be correct to say that a pitch accent phrase is a group of words in which the first word with a drop has a drop, and then every other word in that pitch accent phrase after that is heibon, regardless of its pitch accent in isolation? This then resets if there is another pitch accent phrase in the sentence. The first word with a drop in the pitch accent phrase has a drop, and then after that it's all heibon. I know, however, sometimes there can be more drops at the end of a sentence. Sorry for the long post. I found it a bit difficult to explain, and this concept is rather new to me. Thanks for any guidance you can provide." So basically, I would say that your interpretation is correct. So to kind of step back before I go into the concept of an accent phrase, it's one of the most important concepts to understand with pitch accent is that for any kind of sentence, there's only 2 potential levels of height. So it's like there's high and low, and so there can't be 3 levels. So let's say we take the phrase aki no sora. So aki is a tamadaka, and sora is also a tamadaka. So if this rule that I'm explaining now wasn't true, it would be aki no sora, because it would go from high to low with aki, and then it would go from low to lower with sora, and that would create 3 different actual heights when it regards to pitch, right? Aki no sora. But what I'm saying is that this can never happen because there can only be 2 levels as a max. There can't be 3. And so what this means is that by default, what happens is that it becomes aki no sora, and the sora can't drop because it's already at the bottom pitch. And so this is kind of what you're noticing, right? It can't go lower because it's already at the lowest level. So it just becomes aki no sora. And there's 1 drop between a and ki, and then the sora is basically flat. Now, if you did want to emphasize sora, then you could put an up step, and you can make the sora start higher. And if you did that, then it could drop. So you could say aki no sora, in which case it would go aki, it would go from high to low, and then it would go back to the high level with the so, and then it would go down again. So it will drop if it has room to drop, But if it doesn't have room to drop, then it just won't. And if you say aki no sora, then you're kind of emphasizing the sora. And so that's why it normally wouldn't happen. And so this just is general rule is really important to remember. And it kind of does create this concept of an accent phrase. And so basically, yeah, an accent phrase it's kind of like the smallest possible unit when we're talking about pitch accent. And so what ends up happening is that when you're speaking in natural speech, you'll have longer accent phrases. So it's hard to define an accent phrase because how long an accent phrase is depends on the style of speech. Like, for example, if you listen to an NHK announcer or like an anime voice actor, they're going to hyper enunciate, which means that they're going to have very short accent phrases, and they might actually say the accent of every word. Like, they might say like, 僕はそれはかっこいいと思うんだ, or something like that, where they're like, every word you're actually pronouncing the individual pitch accent. Whereas in real life speech, that's just too much work to say verbally, right? To be constantly going up and down and up and down. And kind of I should to stay on this point for a second. You said, oh, obviously it can't just keep going down forever, right? But the thing is, like, if you're listening to an anime voice actor who has short pitch accent phrases, and so the individual accent is always being actualized, that's not because they're going lower and lower with each drop, is because every time they go low, they go back up high. And so that's why they're staying within the same range, but they can still say it with every accent. So it could be like, let me see, like, let me try to think of a phrase that has a lot of drops. Well, basically, if it was like, 僕はかっこいいと思うんだ. So it's like, 僕はかっこいい. It like goes back up before it goes down. と思うんだ. It like goes up and then goes down. So basically, it will be like this, and they'll still pronounce the accent of every word. But in real life speech, that's too much work to be constantly going up and down. So what might actually happen is it might just be, well, first of all, boku isn't pronounced a tamadaka in natural speech. But if we just ignore that and say it and pretend that it was anyway, it would be like 僕はかっこいいと思うんだよね, or something like. In that case, it would probably have the drop in the boku and the かっこいい, but then the omo would probably just be like flat. And so it wouldn't be like かっこいいと思うんだよね. They probably wouldn't say that. It would probably just be like かっこいいと思うんだよね. And then the rest would be flat. And I wouldn't... Now, you said that the rest of the sentence becomes heibon. I don't know if I would necessarily say it becomes heibon, because heibon has its own pattern where it's like seikatsu, it's like that own kind of eerie flat pattern where it's not really like that. It's more like it kind of just fades out when it's like かっこいいと思うんだよね. It's like just like kind of just like shrivels out slowly. And so so that basically the original point I was making is that it's hard to define what an actual accent phrase is, because the more slurred and natural and fast your speech is, the longer the accent phrases are going to be. And so it could be that an entire sentence with like 10 words in it has like one accent drop, and then the rest is just all kind of flat because it's getting treated as one accent phrase. Because this is the easiest way to speak, right? The less inflection you have, the less energy it takes. Whereas if you're listening to a newscaster, that's the opposite extreme, where every word pretty much will have its own accent phrase. It'll be constantly getting reset. And then real speech is somewhere in the middle. And it's kind of something that you just get an intuition for. After listening to a lot of Japanese, you just kind of start to get an intuition for what sounds natural. And you'll notice that, like, yeah, normally, maybe for each sentence, there'll be like one or two accent phrases. And if they're going to emphasize something, then that might make a new accent phrase where there wouldn't be otherwise. Like, for example, if they're like, それはかっこいいと思うんだけど, or they wanted to like emphasize that it's like, oh, well, I think that it's かっこいい, but maybe some other guy doesn't. Then like maybe you would add a new accent phrase. So a lot of it has to do with the emphasis as well. But I don't think there's any like scientific principles to exactly how it works. I think it's something that you just kind of build an intuition for. And I think it's kind of like a loose, kind of messy thing. And so, yeah, the idea of accent phrases are super important. Hopefully that answered your question. If you have any follow-up questions, then please ask, and I'll answer in the next one. Because this one wasn't upvoted, but I think this is a really important question, so I answered it. And now this will be the last question. So India Heath asks, do you have any recommendation for some decent ergonomic chairs? I saw you mentioned you're trying out a new chair recently, so wanted to get your opinion. I badly need to replace my generic IKEA chair for something that at least has lumbar support, but there's so many options that I'm not even sure what to look for. I only have max 150 euros to spend, so probably can't afford anything too fancy. Any tips would be great. So yeah, so I also used a super crappy chair for a long time, and my back was starting to hurt really badly. And so I looked into ergonomic chairs. And what I learned when I looked into ergonomic chairs is that basically the brand Herman Miller is pretty much the king of ergonomic chairs. And there's this one chair by Herman Miller called the Aeron, which is pretty much the most popular chair of all time. And now that I know what the Aeron is and I know what it looks like, all the time when I'm watching a movie, I'll notice that if there's a scene where there's an office, a lot of people will have an Aeron. Or whenever you see a music studio, there's almost always Aerons in the music studio. And so it's one of the most popular chairs of all time. It's been around for like multiple decades. And the chair that I have is called the M-Body by Herman Miller. And so it's a little bit different, and I really love it. It has this like really interesting kind of spine. Can't really see it that well here, but it's like it can like twist and contort to like the human body, and it's adjustable in like a bunch of different ways, and it totally changed my life. Like my back pain totally went away, and now I can sit at my computer for even longer hours without ever having any pains or anything. And so they are really great. Like, it's a total life changer. It makes way bigger of a difference than you could ever imagine. So I would highly encourage anyone to get a good ergonomic chair, because it's an investment for your body, right? Like, just think about it as, even though the chair might be a lot, that might be money that you're saving on back surgery 20 years down the line, you know? Now, the problem is Herman Miller chairs are super expensive, like outrageously expensive. And like this Herman Miller M-Body new, it's like over $1,000. But I was looking on Craigslist and I got it for $450 in really good condition. So that's still a ton of money. But when you think about that new, it cost like $1,200 or something. That's a really great deal. And an Aeron is also super expensive, but you can find them used pretty easily for like around $500-$600. My brother got super lucky and he picked up an Aeron for $15 at a garage sale. And I think this is probably because the guy, like a lot of offices, if you work at like an office, the office will just have Aerons for everybody. Like the office will get like a deal where they'll buy like 100 at one time and get it a little bit cheaper and then have it for everyone in the office. And so I think one guy, he maybe just brought it home from his office and he didn't realize that it was like an $800 chair. He just thought it was a normal chair. So he sold it for $15 and my brother picked it up. It was in like good condition. So he got amazingly lucky. He got an Aeron for $15. But so anyway, they're pretty expensive. If you want to get like a top of the line chair like this, you probably will have to drop like $500. I definitely recommend getting one used because it's like, they're no different really. Like these chairs are built to last. They're built to last like decades. And so even if you get one used, it'll probably be fine if it's in good condition, and then it'll be worth the money that you save. And I would recommend investing, like I said, because think about if you're anything like me, then you spend a lot of time sitting at your desk chair in front of a computer. And so think about how many hours you're going to end up spending in that chair, you know, like hundreds, thousands of hours. So it's probably worth getting something that's actually going to be able to support your body, save you from having lots of aches and pains and potentially just damaging your back long term. So yeah, you said you have a small budget, but I would encourage like maybe saving up and trying to invest, because it definitely made a difference for me, and it was definitely worth the money. So yeah, so that's all for this week. Thanks for supporting. If any of I know we got some new patrons after the big launch last week, so if any new people are watching, welcome. Thanks for pledging, and I'll see you guys in the next one.